Thanks very much. I should just start by saying I wore this shirt. I thought I might beat him. I didn't. So, what's small-scale DAB? How many people are familiar with this? I would hope a reasonable number of you are familiar with this. Okay, so small-scale DAB is based on previous international work. I think that's important. We talk about the UK experience of this, but actually European experiments, Canadian experiments all led to this. And it started as an initial experiment in Brighton back in 2012. And then there were 10 experimental muxes which have been running across the country ever since on a 6-month experiment. It began with open source technical infrastructure and offering standard traditional DAB services. But very quickly DAB Plus services were introduced and commercial installations of the underlying software have gradually been introduced. It provides localized DAB and DAB Plus services for community stations and for smaller commercial stations. The multiplexes can be operated on a not-for-profit basis, that's the way we do it up in Norwich, or as a commercial entity. For example, the Manchester multiplex is run on a commercial basis. And there are sort of interim models betwixt and between those two extremes. There are some limits on ownership, and they're expected to continue as and when the experiment moves into the full rollout stage. There's also a limit on the number of multiplexes that one organisation will be able to run. The basic idea is that you've got these small-scale local multiplexes, but that you don't want them to become effectively a network by default. So what's the timescale for the introduction of small-scale DAB? Well, the first thing is to say that the secondary legislation almost got kiboshed by the general election. When the first prorogation of Parliament took place, it had got stuck. But when that was then stopped and restarted, it received royal assent. So the Ofcom consultation is currently underway. It's too late if you want to say anything. The responses have all gone in, but Ofcom is now picking over them, and its response is expected to be published in the next few weeks. So that means that the general idea about full-scale licensing is that it will start sometime next year. Now, Ofcom say early next year, but Ofcom said it was a 6-month experiment. Probably it will start with relicensing the trial areas. If we think back to the launch of community radio 10-15 years ago, again a short experiment which then went on forever, but because you've got the stations which are already operating, it seems logical that they will relicense them first, but you can't just relicense them because the use of the frequencies is such that if you're going to do that, you need to plan where else those frequencies are used, and you'll probably end up with slightly larger donuts around each one of those areas. So if you're planning an SSDAB multiplex, it's very, very different from large-scale broadcasting. I think that's important to say, and I'll also let you into a little secret. There's at least one person in this room, possibly more, who've sidled up to me and said, when I retire, I quite like the idea of running one of these things. You might not by the end of this presentation. So the first thing you've got to think about is the coverage area. Now, the coverage areas of these multiplexes are by definition small. They're meant to fill a gap that doesn't already get access to DAB services. And Ofcom has published maps, and those maps give you an idea in many parts of the country of where they expect a particular multiplex to serve. And in some areas where there's a high degree of demand, they're going to have to kind of horse trade between different applications when they know what those applications are. You need to know, for example, how many transmitters are you going to use? And if you think back to this morning's session, talking about coverage of London at a slightly larger scale, one FM transmitter, you probably need 3 or 4 DAB transmitters to achieve similar coverage. Which sites are you going to use? This is about the money. Are you going to go and get to the high quality, big broadcasting sites, or are you going to find a number of slightly less good sites and get that balance right between the delivery of the signals and the cost that that is going to run to? How much redundancy do you need? Are you going to run this as a fully commercial operation? I'll let you into a secret. Most of the small-scale DAB muxes do not offer a maximum service outage time. They don't offer you a quality of service a contract. It is a best endeavours model because that way it's cost effective. It's cost effective for the broadcasters, it's cost effective for the operators. How are you going to get your connectivity? Again, going back to that presentation earlier on this morning, the costs of getting your signals from your studios to your transmitters, it's a large part of the costs. Another secret I'll let you into, our main connectivity to our main site is a bog standard domestic ADSL line. Really, and it's generally very reliable, unless somebody comes and asks for a new connection at that tower block and the BT engineer rocks up and goes, that pair will do, takes it, and then we're on the phone going, have you had an engineer at the tower block today? Oh yes. Did they put in a new line? Oh yes. Could you put it back again? Oh, sorry. That's happened about 3 or 4 times in the last 3 or 4 years. We have a backup Ethernet first mile system which automatically switches in, and that's done via over-air signals via a local ADSL provider. And that's very deliberate because it means that effectively there shouldn't be a single point of failure. We take the signals from the individual stations, from wherever they may be. Some of them are local, some of them are for other parts of the country, and we take them through 2 diverse routes, and then there's automatic switching at the transmitter site, which is, hang on a minute, there's nothing there, pull in the other feed. But it is done on a very low-cost basis. My timer has now become iCloud for some reason, just in case anyone wants to know, because thank you very much. Reliability and uptime, that comes back to the point of what sort of contract are you providing people with, how much are they prepared to pay for these services. And then you come down to that age-old equation, the capital costs versus the recurrent costs. Are you going to invest a lot at the outset, or are you going to try and do it on the cheap, but then maybe pay a lot more in time, effort, and possibly money over the coming months and years of your operation? There's a lot of advice out there. Don't take it from me. Via Mux, for example, I mentioned the Manchester multiplex operators. They're offering services to prospective multiplex operators. I should declare an interest. I'm involved in Open DAB, which does this on a not-for-profit basis. There's also organisations who are already running multiplexes. So, for example, UDAB in London. If you're happy with the command line interface, then you can just go to Open DAB and you can look at it there, and all the information is there. And if you're happy with that, then you probably don't need as much advice as some other people may need. So what are your equipment options? Well, as I say, you can do it the Linux way. That's the way that all of these small-scale DAB multiplexes ran in the first 2 or 3 years of operation. Factum Radioscape, well-known broadcast organisation, we've been trialling some of their equipment recently. AVT, another company that we've played with their equipment from, based over in Germany. Paneda, a Norwegian organisation. And if you're looking at the monitoring side of things, an old name from audio processing days, Innovonics. And there are lots of others. So what are the operational challenges when you're looking at small-scale DAB? Well, the first thing you've got to think about is, what is your income base? How many client stations do you think you're going to get? And that's an interesting one, because at the moment, if you look at the 10 experimental multiplexes running at the moment, they're all full. They're all running 20 services, 20 plus services. I'm not sure that that's going to be the case when there's 40 or 50 of these multiplexes around the country. So I think that if people are basing their model on being able to fill a complete multiplex and operate 20 plus services in any area, unless you're in a large urban conurbation, that's probably not going to be the case. DAB Plus, incidentally, gives a real advantage for the multiplex operators, because it means that if you lose a station because they bail on you because they've decided that actually this wasn't such a good idea after all, you're losing a very small percentage of your income. Whereas if you're running 8, 7, 8, 9 DAB services and you lose one, that's a fairly big hit on your income. So DAB Plus has a real advantage, not just in terms of offering additional services in your local area, but also because it makes your economics potentially more viable. Again, that point about capital versus recurrent expenditure, and that links really into how much expertise do you have. Do you have the in-house expertise to set up your transmission network, to maintain your transmission network, or are you going to need external support? And I would suggest to you that across the range of people that are planning to run these multiplexes, there will be a very wide range of experience. There will be former professional broadcast engineers who have been suckered into this game, but there will also be people who are really very interested in the programming but don't have the technical expertise. And if they don't spend their money at the outset, then they're going to need a lot of external support, I would gently suggest. So let's look at the future digital Norfolk example. What have I learned from that process? What have we learned as the operators of this multiplex? Well, the first thing is, I think I would say, it's been a surprising amount of demand, not just locally, but from other services. So some of the stations which have been very popular are teetering towards setting up networks. And the legislation is quite happy to have networks of stations. It just doesn't want networks of multiplex operators. So, for example, Angel Radio, the station aimed at older people, is very popular across a number of these small-scale multiplexes. Radio Caroline has been surprisingly determined to get on a number of these services. And there are also some broadcasters who are already operating on larger scale multiplexes, but then see these as fillers. So, for example, Chris Country operates on the Suffolk DAB multiplex, but it's also on our Norfolk-Norwich multiplex, and there is a slight overlap of the signal, so people driving into Norfolk from Suffolk can listen across both of those platforms. But I would say that perhaps the most difficult thing that we've encountered is around the area of what's going on your multiplex. You cannot simply sit there all day looking at your radio, tuning through your 20+ services, checking that the audio is there, that the audio levels are correct, that the slideshow material is working, that the DLS is working, etc., etc. You need to monitor it. Now, when we first started this out, we had some basic standard equipment that came with the Open Digital Radio software. Bit clunky. So the first thing we did was we looked around for alternatives. We came across one of the Innovonics pieces of kit, which will monitor your 20 services on your multiplex, and it will scan through them, check each one at a time, and then send out alarms in the case of a failure of any particular type. The trouble is it does only do it sequentially, and that means that if it's taking 2 minutes to check a station, that's not really good enough. If you're the 20th station and you went off just after you were last checked, there's a big gap in your delivery of service. So recently we've been playing with the Factum Radioscape monitoring equipment, and that will monitor all the different services in real time. And it also monitors the quality of your DAB transmissions such that you can react very quickly in the case of a failure. And it has a number of screens, and as you can see, it's checking what the image is, it's giving you your audio levels, it's giving you your DLS messaging, and each of them, in the case of a failure, it will notify you immediately. And you can, obviously with SNMP, you can modify it such that you've got the, I get all the messages, depressing, but individual stations get individual messages. That's expensive though, it's several £1,000s, but it's a very good piece of kit. The alternative is to use, as I say, the Innovonics kit, and that monitors one station at a time. It does give you the same information, and both of those pieces of kit, incidentally, you can also monitor your competition, should you so wish. So I think that's about it. 27 seconds to go. I'm happy to answer any questions. If the horse's mouth will appear. There's some notes there which you will get when you get the slides. Happy to answer questions. Thanks very much. Thank you.